What's going on, everyone? So it's another day, which means another day full of spoilers, and there is one card here that I am absurdly excited about just because of the implications of things like super laser tech have been on villainy. There's a card here that is for heroism in the ramp category that I think could be really, really powerful, especially when, everyone's talking about trying to ramp to Endless Legion or do something crazy with it. I think that is pretty cool, so we're going to try to get as many ways to ramp in a deck as possible, and now we have a heroism version that we're going to talk about, but we're not going to start there. We're going to start here with Mercenary Gunship, guys. If you want to pick up any of the cards when they come out, which is actually coming pretty quickly here, be sure to use my TCG player link in the description down below. With that said, let's talk Mercenary Gunship here. 2 resource space unit, colorless, 3/2 underworld fighter, and it has an action of you could pay 4 to take control of this unit, and any player may use this ability. So essentially, you get to play a cheaper traitoress on your opponent's space unit at any point without using a card in your hand. Here's the thing. Is this actually that big of a downside? Let's say you wanted to play an underworld deck. Let's say you were trying to get your initial 2 drops in. Like, okay, what cards am I interested in playing? Is Mercenary Gunship going to make the cut? Because obviously if you're playing like a Rebel Heroism deck and you want certain other tags, you're probably not going to be playing this card, even if the downside is negligible. You want to match the tags and you want to make sure you have better stats and whatnot. You have more options essentially. But let's say you're playing, as I mentioned, the Underworld deck, and you're looking to have as many Underworld synergies as possible, maybe for Cad Bane purposes or whatever it is. Mercenary Gunship. Is the downside of it being able to be taken over by your opponent a big one? I don't actually think that it is. Now, there are situations that does look pretty bad, right? Like, let's say you're playing an aggro matchup and your opponent is, playing some sort of ground-based strategy. You've led with a couple of Mercenary Gunships, and then they can just pay 4 to actually have... Oh, come on, refocus, guys. Come back to me, camera. Come back to me. Let's say you wanted to, take over your opponent's offense. Come on. You could do it. Well, you could just do that with some resources in the tank, which is kind of crazy. So that does kind of stop the offense from your opponent a little bit and actually give you some potential to fight back and get more damage in. So that's obviously pretty bad. But let's say you're playing in a control matchup, or let's say you're playing in a mid-range matchup. Are they really interested in paying 4 resources to take control? In some cases, yes, right? Because it's like a traitoress, and that is something that's super relevant. But there are some cases where you just be able to trade this off early, or you can get in for some early damage and then eventually trade it off. Or in some cases, your opponent's control gaming is just going to kill this by nature of them trying to remove as much damage as they are possibly going to take. So I do think that this is a downside, but I think there is some potential for it to be played if you are interested in more aggressively statted units, especially in the space category, if you're trying to pair it up with Underworld synergy. So I'm not 100% sure if this is going to be a staple or anything. I think that the only reason you want this is if you want to match the Underworld synergies and you're trying to be aggressive. And if those 2 things match up, maybe Mercenary Gunship's being played, but otherwise it probably isn't worth being played. And do not draft this card. That card is going to be awful in draft. Next up, we have arguably one of the most exciting 1 resource plays in the entire game, and that is Maz Kanata. We have a 1 resource ground unit in Command Heroism, a 1/1 Underworld unit. When you play another unit, give an experience token to this unit. So first things first, if you have any sort of upgrade synergies, granted, it's not playing. Whenever you get a token, it's not playing an upgrade, so that's important to remember. But any sort of upgrade synergies that you want upgrades on your units, that could be really relevant. But it's also, if you just look at it, a 1 resource, potentially 2/2 on turn 1, and then following up into a 3/3 on turn 2, 4/4 on turn 4, etc., etc., etc. This could grow very quick, very fast, or very powerful, very fast. Let's say you go Ewing reinforcements and you hit Maz Kanata plus 2 drop plus 3 drop, or 3 drop plus 3 drop. This becomes a 3/3 when it comes out, like a Battlefield Marine, and you got 2 other 3 drops out of it. Like, there are some really, really powerful options you have with Maz Kanata, and she grows, again, really, really quickly. And if you could play any sort of Sentinel, like let's say you play Maz Kanata on turn 1, you play like an R2-D2 after that, and then you protect it with like an Echo Base Defender on the following turn. She's a 3/3 now for 1 resource, and you got an R2 out of the deal, and she's going to grow even bigger later on. Now, here's the downside with her. If you play it on turn 1, and let's say you play followed up with an R2, your opponent probably has the initiative, and they can probably just kill it on the following turn if they played any sort of ground unit. let's say Battlefield Marine, a Sabine Wren, or they play a Viper Probe Droid or whatever, they'll just kill it and they'll prevent it from growing bigger. But there are some situations where your opponent goes into the space arena, or they're playing a control deck and they take initiative and they were planning on power of the dark siding you. Well, now, yeah, they can power of the dark side you. No big deal. You got a 2/2 and an R2. You let them defeat the R2. You play another unit like Echo Base Defender or whatever 3-drop you have. This becomes a 3/3 and suddenly you're attacking for 3, which is really powerful, and you've avoided your opponent's removal spell, whereas Battlefield Marine wouldn't be able to do that. This, I think, has a lot of potential. It does have the Underworld tag and not the Rebel tag, so that is something to consider, as Rebel tag is pretty relevant when you're considering all the other command heroism cards in the game right now. And that is one thing I see with a lot of the other cards in set 2 is if we're going to go with the same synergies, then, well, it might not be as fluent to run some of these newer cards. However, there might just be a completely different deck, using Boba Fett, for example, with all the different keywords and trying to be aggressive that way. There are different options, but I do think this has potential of being one of the most strong, aggressive, position cards in the format. On to the next one, and this is the card I wanted to talk about more so than any other card on today's list. Spark of Hope. A 2-resource event, command heroism, choose a unit in your discard pile. If it was defeated this phase, put it into play as a resource. So essentially, you're kind of building your own super laser tech, right? Turn 1, you play a Battlefield Marine, let's say. Turn 2, you trade with their ground unit. Both units die. You play Spark of Hope. Boom, you get it into play as a resource. You can play another 1-drop after that or whatever. This looks really, really exciting. And yes, it's not Super Laser Tech, because Super Laser Tech would just have its own individual playstyle, and you can just use Super Laser Tech on its own to get your resource, and it comes into play ready. So it's not as good as Super Laser Tech, I don't think, by any stretch of the imagination, because you do need other setup, you need other units, you need to be able to trade off with a unit or have some unit die that turn. There are other scenarios in which this kind of needs to or potentially is worse than Super Laser Tech. I think overall it's a worse card than Super Laser Tech, but we already see how powerful Super Laser Tech is in basically any sort of longer game, mid-range control, a matchup, soft control, mid-range. You look at Boba Green, you look at Vader Green, you look at Krennic Green, you look at Iden Green. All of them are running a full play set of Super Laser Tech for the most part, and that's because the card is ridiculously strong. Any sort of ramp has been ridiculously strong in this game, and I think one of the biggest reasons for that is because of the fact that you have a free leader deploy at X amount of resources, and so ramping always gets you a payoff, and that payoff is at least your leader, if not more things in your deck. And so with Spark of Hope, I see a lot of potential with this card in a mid-range, let's say Luke Green shell, right? Where you're trying to trade off some of your early units or get in some early pressure, potentially have some higher value units. And then let's say you want to get to later stages, you get to your Ewing reinforcements, you get your Sparks of Hope up, and then boom, you get to Ewing reinforcements a little bit early without just having, or without resupplying, which was the previous other way to ramp in heroism. Of course, you get to play at a 5 resource, what's it called? A 5 resource Super Laser Tech, but that doesn't usually come into play. Now, there is one thing that I wanted to check, and that is you should be able to Han Solo this. So this is the coolest thing. If you Han Solo, put a resource into play on turn 1, let's say, put a 3-drop into play, you go defeat that resource the following next turn. And you can see it says choose a unit in your discard pile if it was defeated this phase. So as far as I understand, it may not have been a unit that was defeated, but it was a resource that was defeated. So that card was actually defeated, and it happened to be a unit. So it was a unit that happened to be defeated that phase. It should be able to be Spark of Hope back with a Han. So that's really, really interesting, because if you go, let's say Han turn 1, you get a 3-drop out, you defeat a resource, you have 3 resources in the following turn, you get to go ahead and play Spark of Hope, and then follow it up with, like, let's say a Spark of Rebellion, because you still have 2 resources if you Han action, and then you get to ramp into Ewing reinforcements even quicker. So there are a lot of potential here, or potential for a lot of different things here, and I think Han Green is one of the situations where I'm most excited about Spark of Hope, and I think it should work. And correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section down below if anyone ended up going through the exact rules implications, but Han says defeat a resource, and this doesn't necessarily specifically state that it needed to be defeated from the battlefield. It can be necessarily from your resource pile, as it reads here. Next up, and lastly, we have one of the fattest legendaries that we're gonna get, I think, in terms of just the cool effect that it has. A 8-costed ground unit in Vigilance Villainy, 6/6. We've seen a very similar stat line with Emperor Palpatine, but what does this guy get you? It gives you each enemy non-leader unit gets -2/-2. So this could straight up just kill a bunch of things that your opponent has on the battlefield. But more likely than not, it's going to shrink down your opponent's bigger units and give you the option to actually trade for a lot of value with your units. Now, for those of you that played Magic for a long time, this is definitely a kind of parallel to Elish Norn back in the day. And well, Elish Norn, she was actually reasonably strong back in the day, but not anymore. This game's obviously very, very different from Magic, of course. But whenever I see, -2/-2 to every, non-leader unit, it makes me really, really interested in kind of seeing the comparison or whatever. But anyways, this doesn't hit your units, which is really, really cool. So if you already have a board, it can shrink down their units and give you a lot of value here. Here's the thing. If we look at Vigilance Villainy, one of the big things that usually Vigilance Villainy falls into is a control shell. And is this card a good controlling card? If you look at like Emperor Palpatine, why Emperor Palpatine's being played, which is the same cost and it falls into control shells, it's because it's a removal spell when it comes down. This can be a removal spell. More than often it's not, but it can also just make you take a lot less damage. So if your opponent goes like, I want to play a Ewing reinforcement, and they get like a Battlefield Marine and an Admiral Akbar and like a Sabine Wren, suddenly playing Supreme Leader Snoke reduces the damage you're taking by like 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever. Maybe they have other units in the battlefield, which is really, really interesting. And of course, Supreme Leader Snoke is actually not going to die most often because it's going to be shrinking your opponent's units. Also, when you come down on turn 7 as an 8 to deploy card, you generally fade the leaders. Like, you've already dealt with your opponent's leaders at this point. So the fact that it doesn't hit leader units doesn't really matter as often. I don't think this card's going to be an extremely powerful control card. What I'm more interested in is potentially some sort of grit synergy. So this is something that would be new with the next set because we don't really have a grit or Vigilance Villainy mid-range deck for the most part. Most of them are like soft control or hard control. That's really what they fall under. And so if we see some sort of like Kira Grit or maybe Gar Saxon, maybe he can take advantage of this by, leveraging the extra upgrades or something like that. Maybe we have something there. I think this guy's really, really cool and he has a really powerful effect, but I'm not really seeing where he's fitting in the meta right now as an 8 cost to get out card. And it doesn't have like an immediate impact in terms of just wrathing your opponent's board or hitting a bunch of units on your opponent's board. It just shrinks things down. And in some cases that can be really good, which it does impact the board when it comes down for sure, but sometimes it's not going to be extremely relevant because, well, maybe they just kill it, or they fell the dragon, or they vanquish, or they power the dark side, or whatever they do, and you don't have an immediate impact that stays around. But I do think this has some potential because it does have a warping effect on the game where if you don't deal with this and you have a bunch of units and that's your main way of gonna, kind of winning the game is a bunch of smaller units or, medium-sized units, this thing just kind of wrecks them. Especially if you're playing like low power, high toughness units, this really messes them up because you probably won't even get damage on your units at all, if that is the case. So interesting, Supreme Leader Snoke. I'm not 100% in on, this being a great card, but I think it has potential, especially since it does have a pretty warping effect on your opponent's units. Overall, though, the card that I'm most excited about truly is the Spark of Hope and the Maz Kanata. I think both those cards could do some really major work, but I'm really interested in seeing if Spark of Hope is going to be as powerful as I think it is and actually introduce maybe some more ramp synergies. If you look at like command heroism specifically, one of the big things was, we didn't really have the super laser tech to go alongside the resupply, so we were kind of running significantly lower amounts of ramp than the villainy side of things. But now let's say you wanted to run double command heroism, which I think is better set up for it on the heroism side of things. You could run command, Spark of Hope, and resupply. You could do the same thing on the double command side of things for villainy, like Emperor Palpatine, super laser tech, resupply, command. But this gives you the heroism option, which we didn't really have before. This, alongside with price on your head, we have so many different additional options of ramping in the game. I'm really curious to see if like a double green ramp, go big, deck is going to be extremely powerful. I imagine it will be, but I'm curious nonetheless. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below, guys. Hopefully you're excited about these cards. I know I am. And without further ado, I'll see you all in the next video.